The morning Adelaide Brooks discovered she was completely alone in the world, she stood in the cramped cabin that smelled of sickness and death, and realized she owned exactly three things: a faded gray dress with patches on the elbows, a pair of worn boots that had belonged to her mother, and a wooden comb missing half its teeth. It was May of 1872, in the mountains outside Santa Fe, New Mexico territory, and her father had been dead less than 12 hours. The sun was barely rising over the pine-covered peaks when she heard the first knock at the door. She opened it to find Mr. Henderson, the mine foreman, his hat in his hands and his face wearing an expression of practiced sympathy that did not quite reach his eyes. "Miss Brooks," he said, not bothering with pleasantries beyond that. "Your father owed the company store near about $40. I will be needing you to settle that debt or vacate these premises by week's end." Adelaide stared at him, her throat tight. "My father just passed. I have not even had time to bury him." "I understand that, miss, and I am sorry for your loss, truly. But the company owns this cabin and we have men waiting for housing. You have until Saturday." He placed his hat back on his head and turned away before she could respond. She closed the door and leaned against it, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. Her father had worked himself to death in those silver mines, coughing up black dust for the last 2 years of his life, and this was what it amounted to. $40 of debt, and 3 days to figure out what came next. The funeral was a sparse affair. The preacher said words over her father's grave that Adelaide barely heard. A few miners attended, men who had worked alongside John Brooks, but they did not linger afterward. Everyone in a mining town knew how quickly fortune could turn, and nobody wanted to be associated with someone who had nothing. By Thursday, Adelaide had sold everything in the cabin that was not nailed down. It amounted to $18. She stood in the empty room that evening, calculating. She needed $22 more, and she had no idea where to get it. That was when Mrs. Palmer from the boarding house came by. She was a severe woman with gray hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her face. "I heard about your situation," Mrs. Palmer said, standing in the doorway. "I have a proposition for you." Adelaide felt her stomach tighten but nodded for the woman to continue. "I need help at the boarding house. Cooking, cleaning, laundry. The work is hard and the hours are long. I can offer you room and board and $2 a month." It was robbery, and they both knew it. A live-in maid in Santa Fe could make $5 or $6 a month easily. But Adelaide also knew she had no leverage to negotiate. "I need to pay off my father's debt first," Adelaide said quietly. Mrs. Palmer's thin lips pressed together. "I suppose I could advance you the money. You would work it off, say a year of service, a year of her life for $22. Adelaide wanted to refuse, wanted to tell this woman exactly what she thought of such an exploitative offer, but she had nowhere else to turn. 6 months, Adelaide countered, her voice steadier than she felt. 10 months, and that is my final offer. Adelaide nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Mrs. Palmer pulled a small purse from her bag and counted out the money with deliberate slowness, making sure Adelaide understood exactly what this transaction meant. The next morning, Adelaide paid Henderson, gathered her 3 possessions, and walked to the boarding house in town. Mrs. Palmer showed her to a tiny room in the attic, barely big enough for the narrow cot and small trunk it contained. The window looked out over the alley where the trash was kept. "You will wake at 4 to start the fires and prepare breakfast," Mrs. Palmer said. "Meals are at 7, noon, and 6. Laundry on Monday and Thursday. You will clean the common areas daily and the guest rooms when they turn over. You may have Sunday afternoons to yourself after the dinner dishes are done." The work was exactly as hard as promised. Adelaide's hands, which had never been soft, became raw and chapped from lye soap and constant washing. She burned her arms on the stove and her fingers on the irons. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached and hauled endless buckets of water until her shoulders felt like they might separate from her body. The boarders were miners, mostly, and railroad men. They tracked in mud and tobacco juice and expected their meals hot and their beds clean. They looked through Adelaide like she was part of the furniture, except for the ones who looked at her in ways that made her skin crawl. Mrs. Palmer watched everything with her sharp eyes, quick to criticize and slow to praise. The food was too cold or too hot, the floors not clean enough, the sheets not white enough. Adelaide bit her tongue and worked harder, counting down the months until she would be free of this place. Summer turned to fall. Adelaide had been at the boarding house for 5 months, and she felt like she had aged 5 years. She caught her reflection in a window one October morning and barely recognized herself. She was 20 years old but looked older, her face thin and drawn, her hair pulled back in a severe knot because she had no time or energy to do anything else with it. That afternoon, Mrs. Palmer called her into the kitchen. "I am having guests for Thanksgiving," she announced. "Important guests. The mayor and his wife, the mine owners, some businessmen from back east. I expect everything to be perfect." Adelaide nodded, already mentally calculating the extra work this would require. "I am going to need you to serve at table," Mrs. Palmer continued. "You will need something appropriate to wear, not that rag you have on." Adelaide looked down at her gray dress, the only one she owned. "I do not have anything else, madam." Mrs. Palmer sighed dramatically. "Of course not. I will advance you money for fabric. You can make something suitable. Add it to what you owe me. Another month should cover it." Adelaide felt something crack inside her chest. 11 months. She had been counting down to freedom, and now it was 11 months away. "Or," Mrs. Palmer said, her voice taking on a calculating tone, "there is another option. Mr. Henderson has been asking after you. He is looking for a wife. A man in his position could provide well for you. You would have a house, security. I could speak to him on your behalf if you like." Adelaide knew Mr. Henderson. He was 50 if he was a day, and he had buried 2 wives already. The rumor was that he worked them as hard as he worked his miners. "Thank you, madam, but no," Adelaide said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I will make the dress." She bought the cheapest fabric she could find, a plain brown cotton that would not show stains. She sewed it by candlelight in her attic room, her fingers cramping around the needle, her eyes straining in the dim light. It was the most joyless creation of a garment imaginable, but when she finished, it fit and it was clean and it would serve its purpose. November arrived with cold winds that swept down from the mountains. Adelaide woke one morning to find frost on the inside of her tiny window. She dressed in the dark, shivering, and made her way downstairs to start the fires. The kitchen was frigid. She was building up the fire in the stove when she heard shouting from outside. Through the window, she could see a commotion in the street. Men were running toward the edge of town, and she could hear someone yelling about a cave-in at the mine. Her hands stilled on the firewood. Cave-ins were common enough in the silver mines around Santa Fe, and they were almost always deadly. She thought of the men who boarded here, who sat at the long table and ate the food she prepared. Some of them were kind, or at least not unkind. Some of them had wives and children. By the time Mrs. Palmer came down, the news had spread throughout the boarding house. 6 men trapped, maybe more. They were digging them out, but it would take time. "Get breakfast on," Mrs. Palmer said sharply. "The men who are not at the mine will still need to eat." Adelaide cooked mechanically, her mind elsewhere. Throughout the day, men came and went with updates. 3 men pulled out alive. 2 confirmed dead, still digging for the others. By evening, the final count was in. 4 dead, 5 injured. None of them were boarders at Mrs. Palmer's establishment, for which the landlady seemed quietly relieved. Adelaide served dinner to a somber group of men who ate in near silence, thinking about their own mortality and how easily those bodies could have been theirs. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Adelaide stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was all there was. Work and survival, and counting down the months until she could start working and surviving somewhere else, for someone else. She tried to remember the last time she had owned something beautiful, something that served no purpose except to bring joy, and could not recall a single instance. Her mother had died when Adelaide was 12, and she had vague memories of a woman who sang while she worked, who could find beauty in small things. But the years after had been hard, and her father had been a practical man focused on survival. There had been no room for prettiness or frivolity. Everything had to be useful, had to serve a purpose. Adelaide fell asleep thinking about wildflowers she had seen growing by the road that summer, bright spots of color against the brown earth. She had wanted to pick them but had not, because what would be the point? They would only die, and she would have to throw them away. Winter settled over the mountains in earnest. The boarding house became a drafty, cold place that Adelaide fought a constant battle to keep warm. She hauled coal and chopped wood and kept the fires burning, her hands chapped and bleeding from the cold and the work. 2 days before Thanksgiving, a stranger arrived at the boarding house. Adelaide answered the door to find a man who looked like he had walked straight out of the mountains themselves. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and arms thick with muscle visible even under his heavy coat. His hair was dark brown and hung past his shoulders, and he had a full beard that was flecked with ice from the cold. His eyes were a striking gray-blue, like a winter sky, and they assessed her with a directness that should have been unsettling but somehow was not. "I need a room," he said. His voice was deep and rough, like he did not use it often. "Just for a few nights." "I will get Mrs. Palmer," Adelaide said, but the man shook his head. "You can handle it, can you not? I am not particular, just need a bed and meals." Adelaide hesitated, knowing Mrs. Palmer would be angry if she conducted business without her, but the cold air was rushing in through the open door, and the man looked frozen. "It is $1 a night, includes 3 meals," she said. "We have a room available on the 2nd floor." The man reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He counted out 3 silver dollars and placed them in Adelaide's hand. His fingers were calloused and rough, his hands scarred from hard work and harder living. "3 nights," he said. "Maybe more. I will let you know." "Your name, sir, for the register?" Adelaide asked, reaching for the ledger Mrs. Palmer kept by the door. "Dalton Donovan." Adelaide wrote his name carefully, aware that he was watching her. "I am Adelaide Brooks. I will show you to your room." She led him upstairs, very conscious of his presence behind her. He was not like the other boarders. They smelled of sweat and tobacco and mine dust. Dalton Donovan smelled of pine smoke and leather and the outdoors, like he carried the mountains with him. The room was small but clean, with a bed, a washstand, and a chair. Dalton looked around and nodded. "This will do fine. What time is supper?" "6 o'clock, Mr. Donovan, down in the dining room." "Just Dalton," he said. "And thank you, Miss Brooks." It was the first time anyone in the boarding house had thanked her for anything in 5 months. Adelaide felt something strange flutter in her chest, something she could not quite name. She went back downstairs to find Mrs. Palmer waiting, her face set in disapproving lines. "Who was that man?" "Why did you not fetch me?" "He needed a room. He paid for 3 nights." Adelaide held out the $3, Mrs. Palmer took the money, examining the coins as if suspecting they might be counterfeit. "You are not to conduct business without consulting me first. Is that understood?" "Yes, madam." "What is his name?" "Dalton Donovan." Mrs. Palmer's eyebrows rose slightly. "Donovan, I have heard that name. He is a trapper, lives up in the mountains somewhere. Brings pelts down to trade a few times a year. They say he is half wild himself." She sniffed disapprovingly. "Well, his money is good, at least. Make sure he does not track mud everywhere." At 6 o'clock, Adelaide served dinner to the boarders. Dalton came down and took a seat at the far end of the long table, away from the other men. He ate steadily and without comment, but Adelaide noticed he watched everything with those sharp gray-blue eyes. After dinner, while Adelaide was clearing the dishes, one of the miners, a man named Jack who had too much to drink most nights, started talking loudly. "Here there is a wild man staying here now. Lives up in the mountains like some kind of animal. Probably got fleas." The other men laughed, glancing toward Dalton. He continued eating, giving no indication that he had heard. Jack, emboldened by the laughter and the whiskey, raised his voice. "I am talking to you, mountain man. You understand English? Or do you just grunt and point?" Dalton set down his fork and looked at Jack. He did not say anything, just looked at him, and something in that gaze made Jack's smile falter. "I understand English just fine," Dalton said quietly. "Do you understand when a man wants to be left alone to eat his meal in peace?" Jack's face reddened. "I was just making conversation." "Were you? Sounded more like you were trying to start something you are not prepared to finish." The room had gone very quiet. Adelaide stood frozen by the sideboard, a stack of dirty plates in her hands. Jack stood up, swaying slightly. "You threatening me?" Dalton remained seated, but there was a coiled quality to his stillness that reminded Adelaide of a mountain cat right before it pounced. "No. I am telling you to sit down and mind your own business." For a moment, it could have gone either way. Then one of the other miners, an older man named Pete, grabbed Jack's arm. "Sit down, Jack. You are drunk and being a fool." Jack jerked his arm away but sat down, muttering under his breath. Dalton went back to his meal as if nothing had happened. Adelaide realized she had been holding her breath and let it out slowly. She finished clearing the dishes and retreated to the kitchen, her hands shaking slightly as she washed the plates. She was not sure why the confrontation had affected her so much. Men postured and argued all the time, but there had been something different about the way Dalton had handled it. He had not been looking for a fight, but he had made it clear he could finish one if necessary. Later that evening, after the dishes were done and the kitchen was clean, Adelaide stepped out the back door for a moment of peace. The night was cold and clear, the stars sharp overhead. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in her thin dress, but reluctant to go back inside just yet. "You should have a coat." Adelaide spun around to find Dalton standing in the shadows near the back of the building. He must have come out for a smoke or some air. "I did not expect to be out long," she said. He nodded and was quiet for a moment, then said, "I am sorry if I caused trouble at dinner." "You did not. Jack causes his own trouble." Dalton's mouth quirked slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "True enough." He paused. "You work very hard. I have seen you moving since before dawn." Adelaide felt oddly self-conscious under his regard. "It is my job, still. Hard work." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They stood in the cold darkness for another moment, and then Adelaide said, "I should go in. More work to do before bed. Good night, Miss Brooks." "Good night, Mr. Donovan. Dalton, I mean." She thought she saw him smile as she went inside, but it was too dark to be sure. The next day was a whirlwind of preparation for Thanksgiving. Mrs. Palmer had Adelaide scrubbing everything that could be scrubbed. polishing everything that could be polished, and preparing food from dawn until late into the night. Adelaide barely saw the boarders. They got their breakfast and dinner as usual, but Adelaide was too busy to do more than set the food on the table and disappear back into the kitchen. She was rolling out pie crust late that afternoon when Mrs. Palmer came in. "I am going to the dry goods store," she announced. "I need more butter and some spices. I will be back within the hour. Try not to burn anything while I am gone." After she left, Adelaide continued working, her arms aching from rolling dough. She had made 4 pies already and had 2 more to go. Her back hurt, her feet hurt, and she was so tired she felt like she might fall asleep standing up. She was sliding the 5th pie into the oven when she heard the back door open. She turned, expecting Mrs. Palmer back early, but instead found Dalton standing there with something in his hands. "Thought you might like these," he said, and held out a small bunch of wildflowers. Adelaide stared at them. They were asters, the last flowers that bloomed before winter truly set in, purple and white and impossibly delicate. In the middle of her exhaustion and the heat of the kitchen and the endless gray drudgery of her life, they looked like something from another world. "Where did you find those?" she asked, her voice coming out strange and tight. "There is a meadow about 2 miles up the mountain. South-facing, protected from the worst of the wind. They still had some blooming." He held them out further. "For you." Adelaide wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron, not sure what to do. Nobody had given her flowers before. Nobody had given her anything pretty before. "Why?" she asked. Dalton looked puzzled by the question. "Because I thought you would like them. Was I wrong?" "No, I just—" Adelaide swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in her throat. "Thank you. They are beautiful." She took the flowers carefully as if they might break. Dalton nodded, looking pleased, and then seemed unsure what to do next. "I should let you get back to work," he said. After he left, Adelaide found a jar and filled it with water, arranging the flowers carefully. She set them on the windowsill where she could see them while she worked. They looked impossibly bright and alive against the dingy kitchen walls. She found herself smiling as she finished the last pie, something she had not done in longer than she could remember. That night, after everyone had eaten and the dishes were done and the kitchen was clean, Adelaide sat on her narrow bed and looked at the flowers Dalton had given her. She had brought them upstairs, not wanting to leave them where Mrs. Palmer might throw them out. In the flickering light of her single candle, the purple petals seemed to glow. Adelaide reached out and touched one gently, feeling the silky texture. Something inside her chest felt like it was cracking open, something she had kept locked away for a very long time. She fell asleep with the flowers on the trunk beside her bed, their faint wild scent mixing with the smell of wood smoke and winter. Thanksgiving morning arrived in a rush of last-minute preparations. Adelaide was up at 3, starting fires and putting the turkeys in to roast. By the time the sun rose, the kitchen was sweltering and Adelaide was already sweating through her work dress. Mrs. Palmer's guests were due at 3 o'clock. Adelaide spent the morning cooking and baking, preparing enough food to feed an army. Mrs. Palmer fluttered around, getting in the way more than helping, her anxiety making her even more critical than usual. "The potatoes are lumpy. Mash them again. That gravy is too thin. Add more flour. Is that tablecloth clean? It does not look clean. Wash it again." Adelaide did everything she was told, biting her tongue until she tasted blood. The boarders got a cold lunch because there was no time to prepare anything hot. Most of them did not complain, understanding what was happening, but Jack made some comment about it being a sorry state of affairs when a boarding house could not even provide a hot meal. At 2 o'clock, Mrs. Palmer sent Adelaide upstairs to change into her brown dress. And do something with your hair. You look like you've been dragged backward through a hedge." Adelaide did her best, pinning her hair up neatly and putting on the brown dress. It was already damp with sweat from the kitchen, but it was cleaner than her work dress. She looked at herself in the small, cracked mirror in her room and saw a thin, tired girl in an ugly dress. The wildflowers on her trunk seemed to mock her, beautiful and bright against the drabness of everything else. She went back downstairs to find Mrs. Palmer's guests arriving. The mayor was a portly man with elaborate sideburns. His wife a severe woman in a dress that probably cost more than Adelaide would make in 5 years. The mine owners and businessmen were similar types, well-fed and well-dressed, their wives dripping with jewelry and expensive fabrics. Adelaide served them at table, pouring wine and bringing out course after course of food. She tried to be invisible, to just blend into the background, but she was aware of their glances, the way they assessed her and dismissed her in the same moment. The conversation was about profits and investments and people Adelaide had never heard of. She stood by the sideboard, waiting to refill glasses or bring more food, and felt more alone than she had felt even in the days after her father died. The meal seemed to go on forever. By the time Adelaide brought out the pies, her feet were screaming and her head was pounding. She served the dessert, poured coffee, and finally was able to retreat to the kitchen to start the massive job of cleaning up. She was elbow-deep in dishwater when she heard the door open. She turned, expecting Mrs. Palmer with more demands, but instead found Dalton. "What are you doing here?" Adelaide asked. "I thought you would be at the meal with the other boarders. I ate earlier, did not feel like company." He looked around the kitchen at the mountains of dirty dishes, the pots and pans waiting to be scrubbed, the general chaos of a major meal. "You need help, I can manage. I know you can, but you should not have to." Before Adelaide could protest, he had rolled up his sleeves and started bringing in dishes from the dining room. He stacked them efficiently, scraping the leftover food into the scrap bucket, organizing everything so it was easier for Adelaide to wash. They worked in silence for a while, falling into a rhythm. Dalton brought in the dishes and scraped them, Adelaide washed, and Dalton dried and put away. It should have been awkward, this strange mountain man working in a kitchen with her, but somehow it was not. It was actually nice, having someone there who was helping and not criticizing. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Adelaide asked finally, unable to hold the question back any longer. Dalton was quiet for a moment, drying a plate with careful attention. "I have lived alone for a long time," he said finally. "You get good at watching people when you are not busy talking all the time. I see you working yourself to death for someone who does not appreciate it. I see you getting thinner and more tired every day. I see a woman who deserves better than what she is getting." Adelaide felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back hard. "You do not know anything about me. I know enough." He set down the plate and turned to look at her. "I know you are stronger than you think you are. I know you have not had an easy time of it. And I know that when I gave you those flowers yesterday, you looked at them like I had handed you the moon." A tear escaped and rolled down Adelaide's cheek before she could stop it. She wiped it away quickly with her wet hand, leaving a streak of soap suds across her face. "I am sorry," she said. "I do not know what is wrong with me." "Nothing is wrong with you." Dalton reached out and gently wiped the soap suds from her cheek with his thumb. His hand was rough and warm, and Adelaide found herself leaning into the touch without meaning to. "You are just tired and overworked and probably have not had anyone be kind to you in a long time." "I cannot remember the last time someone was," Adelaide admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Dalton's hand dropped away, but his eyes stayed on her face, intense and searching. "That is a damn shame." They finished the dishes together, By the time Mrs. Palmer's guests finally left and the landlady came into the kitchen, everything was clean and put away. She looked around suspiciously, as if looking for something to criticize, but could find nothing. "I suppose that will do," she said finally. "Mr. Donovan, I did not expect to find you in my kitchen." "I was helping Miss Brooks," Dalton said calmly. "Seemed like a lot of work for one person." Mrs. Palmer's lips pressed into a thin line. "Adelaide is paid to do that work, but I suppose there is no harm done. You may go, Adelaide. I will see you at 4 tomorrow morning." Adelaide nodded and started toward the back stairs, but Dalton fell into step beside her. "I will walk you up," he said. "That is not necessary. Maybe not, but I am going that way anyway." They climbed the stairs together. When they reached the second floor where Dalton's room was, he did not stop but continued up to the attic with her. At her door he paused. "Sleep well, Miss Brooks." "Adelaide," she said. "If you are going to call yourself Dalton, you should call me Adelaide." He smiled, a real smile this time that transformed his face and made her stomach do a strange flip. "Good night, Adelaide." "Good night, Dalton." She went into her room and closed the door, leaning against it for a moment. The wildflowers were still on her trunk, a little wilted now but still beautiful. She touched one of the petals gently, and then got ready for bed, more tired than she could ever remember being, but somehow feeling lighter than she had in months. The next morning, Adelaide woke to find frost patterns on her small window. She dressed quickly in the freezing air and made her way downstairs in the pre-dawn darkness. To her surprise, the kitchen fire was already going, the room warming nicely. Dalton was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking perfectly at home. "You are up early," Adelaide said. "Mountain habit. Sun wakes you up whether you like it or not." He gestured to the stove. "Got the fire started for you, figured it would help. Thank you." Adelaide went to start breakfast, feeling oddly flustered by his presence. "You did not have to do that, I know." They fell into a comfortable silence as Adelaide worked. Dalton watched her, drinking his coffee, occasionally offering to help with small things. It felt domestic and strange and somehow right, all at the same time. When Mrs. Palmer came down an hour later, she found breakfast well underway and Dalton gone, having slipped out at some point without Adelaide quite noticing. "Did Mr. Donovan eat already?" Mrs. Palmer asked, looking around suspiciously. "Just coffee, I think." "Strange man," Mrs. Palmer muttered. "I will be glad when he leaves. Men like that make me nervous. Too unpredictable." Adelaide did not respond, focusing on flipping flapjacks. She found herself hoping Dalton would not leave too soon, then wondered why she cared. Over the next few days, a pattern developed. Adelaide would come down to find the fire already started. Dalton would appear at odd moments to help with heavy lifting or difficult tasks. He did not say much, but his presence was becoming a constant in her day, something she found herself looking forward to. On the third morning after Thanksgiving, Adelaide came down to find not just the fire started, but a small bouquet of fresh flowers on the kitchen table. She picked them up, marveling at them. They were different from the first bunch, tiny yellow blooms that she did not recognize. "Winter cress," Dalton said from the doorway, making her jump. "Sorry, did not mean to startle you. They grow by the creek, even in winter. Tough little things." "They are lovely," Adelaide said, touching the petals gently. "But you should not have. You have done so much already." "It is nothing. Just flowers." But they were not just flowers to Adelaide. They were the first beautiful things she had owned in as long as she could remember. The first things given to her just because someone thought she might like them, with no ulterior motive or expectation attached. "They mean something to me," she said quietly, "more than you might think." Dalton looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Good, that is what I was hoping for." "Why?" Adelaide asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since the first bouquet. "Why do you care?" Dalton crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look at his face. He was so much taller than her, so much broader, all hard muscle and weathered strength. But his eyes were gentle as they looked down at her. "Because I look at you and I see someone who has been working so hard just to survive that she has forgotten there is supposed to be more to life than that," he said. "Because I have been where you are, so focused on getting through each day that I forgot to look for the beauty in it. Because when I gave you those first flowers and saw your face, I realized I wanted to keep seeing that look, wanted to be the one to put it there." Adelaide's heart was beating so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. "I do not understand. Do you not?" His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "I think you do, Mr. Donovan." Adelaide started, but he shook his head. "Dalton, and you do not have to say anything. I am not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know why." He dropped his hand and stepped back, and Adelaide felt the loss of his warmth like a physical thing. Before she could say anything else, Mrs. Palmer's voice came from somewhere above, calling for her. "I should go," Adelaide said, clutching the flowers. "Adelaide." She turned back. "Would you take a walk with me this afternoon? If Mrs. Palmer can spare you for an hour. She usually gives me Sunday afternoons. But today is only Saturday. Ask her anyway. Tell her you have an errand to run, please." Adelaide nodded, not trusting her voice, and hurried out of the kitchen with the flowers still in her hands. The morning passed in a blur. Adelaide could not stop thinking about Dalton's words, the feel of his hand on her face, the way he looked at her like she was something precious. It was terrifying and thrilling and confusing all at once. At lunch, she gathered her courage and approached Mrs. Palmer. "Madam, I was wondering if I might have the afternoon off. I have an errand I need to run." Mrs. Palmer looked up from her plate with raised eyebrows. "An errand? What kind of errand?" "A personal matter, madam. You know Saturday is a busy day. I need you here." "Please, madam, just a few hours. I will work extra tomorrow to make up for it." Mrs. Palmer studied her with suspicious eyes. "This does not have anything to do with Mr. Donovan, does it?" Adelaide felt her face heat. "He offered to show me where he finds the wildflowers, that is all." "That is all. Adelaide, I have seen the way that man looks at you, and the way you look at him. I am not blind." "He has been a perfect gentleman," Adelaide said, which was true. "Men like that are never gentlemen. They are wild and rough, and they will ruin you if you let them." Mrs. Palmer set down her fork. "But I suppose you are going to do what you want regardless of what I say. Fine. You may have until supper. But if you are not back in time to help prepare the evening meal, I will add another month to what you owe me." Adelaide wanted to argue that she did not owe Mrs. Palmer anything beyond the original agreement, that the woman was exploiting her shamelessly, but she held her tongue. "Yes, madam." "Thank you." She found Dalton waiting by the back door, dressed in his heavy coat and hat. He had a coat draped over his arm, which he held out to her. "You will need this. It is cold out." "That is your coat." "I have another. Take it." The coat was heavy wool and far too big for her, but it was warm and smelled like Dalton, like pine and leather and mountains. Adelaide wrapped it around herself gratefully. They walked through town and up into the foothills, not talking much at first. The day was cold but clear, the sun bright in a pale blue sky. Adelaide's breath puffed white in the air, and she could feel the frozen ground crunching under her boots. "This way," Dalton said, leading her off the main path and onto a narrow trail that wound up through the pine trees. They climbed for perhaps half an hour, Adelaide huffing from the exertion and the altitude. Dalton shortened his long strides to match hers, patient and unhurried. Finally, they emerged into a small meadow, just as Dalton had described. It was south-facing and sheltered by rocks and trees, catching the full warmth of the winter sun. And scattered across it, impossibly, were patches of wildflowers. Not many, just small clusters of brave blooms that had somehow survived the frost. "Oh," Adelaide breathed, stopping at the edge of the meadow. "It is beautiful. Thought you would like it." Dalton watched her face rather than the meadow. "This place always reminds me that even when things are hard and cold, there is still beauty if you know where to look for it." They walked across the meadow, and Adelaide knelt beside a cluster of purple asters, touching them gently. "How did you find this place?" "I have a cabin about 3 miles further up the mountain. I stumbled across this meadow last spring and have been coming back ever since. In summer, the whole thing is covered in flowers, every color you can imagine. That must be incredible. I will bring you back in the spring if you want, show you how it looks then." Adelaide looked up at him, this man who barely knew her but who seemed to understand something essential about her that she had not even understood about herself. "Why would you do that?" Dalton crouched down beside her, his eyes level with hers. "Because I am hoping you will still be around in the spring, because I am hoping this is not the only afternoon I get to spend with you. I am contracted to Mrs. Palmer for 10 more months. Contracts can be broken, debts can be paid. Not by me. I have no money, no skills beyond cooking and cleaning. This is my life now for at least the next year. What if it did not have to be?" Dalton reached out and took her hand, his large, rough fingers closing around her small, chapped ones. What if there was another option? Adelaide's heart was racing again. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I live alone in a cabin on the mountain. I trap and hunt and trade my pelts for supplies a few times a year. It is a hard life, but it is free. I answer to no one, oh no one. I have been doing it alone for 5 years now, and it is a good life. But it would be a better life with someone to share it. You cannot be suggesting what I think you are suggesting." "Why not? I am 26 years old, Adelaide, old enough to know my own mind. I have met a lot of people in my life, and I have never met anyone who made me want to change the way I live. Until now. You barely know me. I know you are strong and hard-working. I know you do not complain even when you have every right to. I know you look at flowers like they are miracles. I know that when you smile, which you do not do nearly enough, it lights up your whole face." He squeezed her hand gently. "I know that I wake up thinking about you and go to sleep thinking about you and spend most of the day looking for excuses to be near you. Is that not knowing enough?" Adelaide could barely breathe. "Dalton, I cannot just run away with you. That is crazy. Maybe, or maybe it is the sanest thing either of us could do." He paused. "I am not asking you to decide right now. I am just asking you to think about it. I am staying in town for another week, finishing up some business. You have that time to consider it. If you say no, I will go back to my mountain and you will never see me again. If you say yes, we can leave together and you will never have to scrub another floor for Mrs. Palmer or anyone else." "And if I say yes, what would you expect from me?" Adelaide asked, needing to understand exactly what he was proposing. Dalton looked at her steadily. "I would expect you to be my wife if you are willing. I am not offering to take you as some kind of servant or worse. I am offering marriage, a real partnership. You would keep the cabin, cook our meals, help with the work that needs doing. I would provide for you, protect you, treat you with respect. And I would give you wildflowers every morning of your life if that is what you want." Tears were running down Adelaide's face now, and she did not bother to wipe them away. "Why would you want to marry someone like me? I am nothing. I have nothing. I am just a poor girl in an ugly dress who scrubs floors for a living. You are wrong." Dalton's voice was fierce. "You are beautiful and strong and brave. You have survived things that would have broken other people. You deserve to have someone bring you flowers and tell you how remarkable you are. You deserve to wake up in the morning and not immediately start working yourself to death. You deserve a life that has beauty in it, not just survival. Adelaide was sobbing now, great gulping sobs that she could not control. Dalton pulled her against his chest, his arms coming around her, holding her while she cried. She could not remember the last time someone had held her, had offered comfort instead of criticism. "I am sorry," she gasped against his coat. "I am sorry, I do not mean to fall apart like this. Do not apologize. Cry as much as you need to, I have got you." They stayed like that for a long time, Adelaide crying out months of exhaustion and loneliness and grief while Dalton held her steady and safe. Finally, her sobs subsided into hiccups and then into shaky breaths. "I must look a mess," she said, pulling back and wiping her face with her hands. "You look just fine." Dalton pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and handed it to her. "Better, actually, like something hard and tight inside you finally let go." Adelaide wiped her face and blew her nose, then tried to hand the handkerchief back. Dalton shook his head with a small smile. "Keep it. I have others." They sat in the meadow for a while longer, not talking, just being together in the winter sunshine. Adelaide felt wrung out but also lighter, as if crying had released some weight she had been carrying. Finally, Dalton said, "We should head back. I do not want you to be late and give Mrs. Palmer an excuse to be harder on you." They walked back down the mountain, Dalton holding Adelaide's hand to help her over the rough spots. When they reached the edge of town, he let go reluctantly. "Think about what I said," he told her. "Really think about it, and whatever you decide, I will respect it." Adelaide nodded, not trusting her voice. She returned his coat and walked back to the boarding house, feeling like she was in a dream. The next week was the strangest of Adelaide's life. She went through her daily routine in a daze, her mind constantly churning over Dalton's proposal. Marriage, a life in the mountains, freedom from Mrs. Palmer and her endless demands. It sounded too good to be true, which meant it probably was. But every morning she found fresh flowers waiting for her in the kitchen. Sometimes it was just a single bloom, sometimes a small handful, but they were always there. Dalton continued to help her with small tasks, but he did not pressure her or bring up his proposal again. He was simply present, steady and reliable and kind. Adelaide watched him when she thought he was not looking, trying to imagine what life with him would be like. He was so different from anyone she had ever known. He moved with a quiet confidence, comfortable in his own skin in a way she envied. He was patient and gentle despite his size and obvious strength. When he looked at her, she felt seen in a way she had never experienced before, but marriage was a huge step. She barely knew him, really. What if she agreed and then found out he was not the man he seemed? What if the mountain life was too hard? What if he changed once they were married, became controlling or cruel like so many men she had seen? On the other hand, what were her alternatives? Stay with Mrs. Palmer for 10 more months and then what? Find another position somewhere else, working herself to exhaustion for barely enough to survive. Maybe eventually marry someone like Mr. Henderson if she was lucky enough to get such an offer. That was not a life. That was just slow death by drudgery. Sunday afternoon came, her regular time off. Dalton found her in the kitchen after the dinner dishes were done. "Walk with me," he asked. They went to the same meadow, climbing the familiar trail in comfortable silence. The sun was lower in the sky this time, painting everything in shades of gold and orange. When they reached the meadow, Dalton led Adelaide to a flat rock and they sat together, looking out over the view. "Have you thought about it?" he asked after a while. "I have thought about nothing else," Adelaide admitted. "But I am scared, Dalton. What if I make the wrong choice?" What if you make the right one? How can I know? He turned to look at her, his gray-blue eyes serious. You cannot know for certain. That is not how life works. But I can tell you this. I will never raise my hand to you in anger. I will never demean you or make you feel small. I will work hard to provide for us both, and I will do my best every single day to make sure you never regret choosing me. That is a big promise. I am a man who keeps my promises. Adelaide believed him. That was the thing. Despite her fears and doubts, she believed he meant every word he said. What about love? She asked quietly. You have not mentioned that. I have not, Dalton agreed. Because I figure that is something that grows over time if you let it. I care about you, Adelaide. A lot. I think about you all the time. When I see something beautiful, my first thought is that I want to share it with you. When I imagine my future, you are in it. Maybe that is not love yet, but I think it could become love given time. Do you think you could feel that way about me? Adelaide thought about her morning ritual of looking for the flowers Dalton left her. The way her heart lifted when she heard his voice. How safe she felt when he was near. How she had started to imagine what it would be like to wake up next to him, to build a life together. Yes, she said softly. I think I could. I think maybe I already do a little. Dalton's face broke into a wide smile, the first really open expression she had seen from him. Is that a yes, then? You will marry me? Adelaide took a deep breath. This was it. The moment that would change everything. She could say no, stay safe in her misery, continue the life she knew, or she could say yes, take a leap of faith and hope she did not fall. Yes, she said, the word coming out stronger than she expected. Yes, I will marry you. Dalton let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around. Adelaide found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in years. When he set her down, his hand stayed on her waist, and he looked down at her with such happiness in his eyes that it took her breath away. You will not regret this, he said. I swear to you, Adelaide, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you do not regret this. I believe you. And she did. We can get married tomorrow if you want. Go to the preacher first thing in the morning. What about Mrs. Palmer? I am contracted to her. She could make trouble. Let her try. You are not a slave. You are a free woman, and if you want to leave, you can leave. I will pay her the rest of what you supposedly owe if I have to, though God knows she has gotten more than her money's worth out of you already. Adelaide felt a weight lift off her shoulders that she had not even realized she was carrying. Tomorrow, then. We will get married tomorrow. They stayed in the meadow until the sun started to set, making plans. Dalton explained that his cabin was small but well built, with a good stove and a stone fireplace. He had supplies enough to last the winter, and they could go to town for anything else they needed. In spring, he would teach her about trapping and hunting, about which plants were good to eat and which to avoid. She would not be isolated, but the nearest neighbor was a good 10 miles away. It would be a quiet life, a hard life in some ways, but a free one. When they finally returned to town, full dark had fallen. At the back door of the boarding house, Dalton pulled Adelaide close one more time. I will be here at 8 in the morning, he said. Pack whatever you want to take with you, though honestly, you do not need much. I can provide everything you need. What if Mrs. Palmer will not let me leave? Then I will carry you out over my shoulder if I have to. He said it lightly, but Adelaide could hear the steel underneath. Dalton would not let Mrs. Palmer stand in their way. Adelaide went inside, her mind whirling. She made her way up to her attic room and looked around at her few possessions. It would not take long to pack. She had so little. The irony was not lost on her, that she was about to marry a mountain man and move to a cabin in the wilderness, and it still represented a step up in her life. She barely slept that night, too excited and nervous. Before dawn, She dressed in her gray work dress and packed her few things into a small cloth bag. The brown dress, her mother's boots, the comb, the handkerchief Dalton had given her, and the latest flowers he had brought her, pressed between the pages of the small Bible that had been her mother's. At 4 o'clock, she went downstairs for the last time to start the fires and make breakfast. Her hands were shaking as she worked, but she felt more alive than she had in years. Mrs. Palmer came down at her usual time and immediately sensed something was different. "What is going on with you?" she demanded. "You are acting strange." "I am leaving," Adelaide said, the words coming out before she had planned them. "This morning I am getting married." Mrs. Palmer's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, anger, calculation. "Married to whom? That mountain man?" "Adelaide, do not be a fool. Men like that do not marry girls like you. He is using you." "He is not. We are getting married this morning by the preacher." "You are contracted to me for 10 more months. You cannot just leave." "Yes, I can. I am not a slave, Mrs. Palmer. I am a free woman, and I choose to leave. You owe me money, for the fabric for that dress, for your room and board, for all the food you have eaten. You have worked me like a dog for months for barely any pay. You have gotten far more out of me than I have cost you, and we both know it." Mrs. Palmer's face flushed red. "How dare you speak to me like that, after all I have done for you, giving you a place to stay when you had nothing?" "You have done nothing for me that you did not profit from," Adelaide said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "And I am leaving. If Dalton needs to pay you something to settle my supposed debt, he will, but I am done here." "You will regret this," Mrs. Palmer spat. "You will come crawling back within a month, and I will not take you in. You will end up on the streets or worse. I will take my chances." Adelaide finished making breakfast, served it to the boarders, and then went upstairs to get her bag. When she came back down, Dalton was waiting by the back door, looking calm and confident. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready." Mrs. Palmer appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face still flushed with anger. "Mr. Donovan, I hope you realize you are ruining this girl's life." "No, madam," Dalton said politely. "I am trying to give her a better one. How much does Adelaide supposedly owe you?" $25. It was an outrageous amount, far more than Adelaide actually owed even by Mrs. Palmer's creative accounting. But Dalton just reached into his coat and counted out the money without argument. "There. We are square. Come on, Adelaide." They walked out together into the cold morning air. Adelaide did not look back. The preacher was a kind older man who asked no questions beyond the basics. Yes, they were both of age and free to marry. Yes, they came of their own free will. Did they have 2 witnesses? Dalton went outside and found 2 men on the street, offered them $1 each to stand witness, and they agreed readily enough. The ceremony was short and simple. Adelaide repeated the vows in a voice that shook only slightly, and Dalton's voice was strong and sure. The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and just like that, Adelaide Brooks became Adelaide Donovan. Outside the church, Dalton pulled her into a gentle kiss there first. His lips were warm and soft, the kiss sweet and careful, full of promise. "Hello, wife," he said when they broke apart. "Hello, husband," Adelaide replied, and started to laugh, giddy with the reality of what they had just done. They went to the general store, where Dalton bought supplies, and Adelaide tried not to feel guilty about the money he was spending. He seemed to have plenty, the result of 5 years of careful trapping and saving, and he was generous without being reckless. "You need proper winter clothes," he said, leading her to the section with women's things. "A good coat, warm dresses, sturdy boots. Pick what you need." "Dalton, this is too much." "It is not. You are my wife now. It is my job to provide for you, and I am not sending you up to the cabin in that thin dress and worn-out boots." His voice was gentle but firm. "Please, Adelaide, let me do this." So Adelaide picked out clothes, still choosing the practical and plain but reveling in the simple fact that they were new and they fit, and they were hers. A heavy wool coat, 2 warm dresses in dark blue and brown, new boots, a warm shawl, heavy stockings, and new undergarments that made her blush to purchase in front of Dalton. He also bought supplies for the cabin: coffee, flour, sugar, dried beans, salt pork, and various other staples. Everything was loaded onto a mule he had apparently left at the livery before coming into town. By noon, they were ready to leave. Adelaide stood at the edge of Santa Fe, looking back at the town that had been her home for the last 5 months, and felt nothing but relief to be leaving it behind. "Second thoughts?" Dalton asked, watching her face. "Not even for a moment." They started up the trail toward the mountains, the mule following behind on a lead rope. It was a hard climb, made harder by Adelaide's fatigue from months of overwork and poor food. But Dalton was patient, stopping frequently to let her rest, offering her water and bits of jerky. "Are you all right?" he asked during one of their stops. "We can go slower if you need to." "I am fine, just out of shape." "You will build your strength back up. Good food and mountain air will do wonders." They climbed all afternoon. The trail wound through pine forests and across rocky slopes, always going up. The views were breathtaking when they emerged from the trees, vast vistas of mountains stretching away in every direction. Finally, as the sun was starting to set, Dalton said, "There, that is home." Adelaide looked where he was pointing and saw a cabin nestled against the side of the mountain, protected by a stand of pines and a rocky outcropping. It was small but looked solid, with smoke already rising from the chimney. "Did you leave a fire going?" she asked. "No, my neighbor must have come by. He does that sometimes when he knows I am going to be gone for a while." They approached the cabin and a man emerged, older, grizzled, with a thick gray beard. He raised a hand in greeting. "Dalton, good to see you back. I kept the place warm for you." He looked at Adelaide with curious but kind eyes. "And who is this?" "This is Adelaide, my wife. We just got married this morning." The old man's eyebrows shot up and then he broke into a wide smile. "Well, I will be damned. You finally went and did it. Congratulations." He held out a hand to Adelaide. "Name's Jake Morrison. I live about 10 miles that way." "Always good to have another soul up here in the high country." "Nice to meet you, Mr. Morrison," Adelaide said, shaking his hand. "Jake, please. Anyone married to this big lug is a friend of mine." He clapped Dalton on the shoulder. "I will leave you two to settle in. Adelaide, if you ever need anything or if Dalton gives you any trouble, you come find me. I will set him straight." After Jake left, Dalton led Adelaide into the cabin. It was one large room with a sleeping loft above. The floor was made of rough planks, the walls of notched logs chinked with mud. But it was clean and well organized, with a good iron stove, a stone fireplace, a table and chairs, shelves for supplies, and various tools and equipment hung neatly on the walls. "I know it is not much," Dalton said, sounding uncertain for the first time since she had met him. "It is wonderful," Adelaide said honestly. "It is clean and warm and it is ours. That is more than enough." Dalton relaxed and smiled. "Let me show you around." He gave her a tour, pointing out where everything was kept. The loft above held a large bed covered in what looked like a dozen quilts and furs. There was a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the cabin, currently full of potatoes, turnips, onions, and other vegetables that would keep through the winter. A small barn sheltered Dalton's horse and mule and had room for storing hay and equipment. "The spring is about 100 yards that way," Dalton said, pointing. "Never freezes, even in the dead of winter. Sweet water, best you will ever taste." He showed her the smokehouse, the woodpile, the small cleared area where he said they could plant a garden in spring. Everything was well maintained and thoughtfully arranged. This was not just a place where Dalton survived. It was a home he had built with care. Back inside, Dalton started a fire in the fireplace to supplement the stove. "You must be exhausted. When did you sleep last?" "Not much last night. I was too nervous." "Why do you not rest? I will make us something to eat." "You do not have to do that. I can cook." "I know you can. But today has been a big day, and you are tired, and I am perfectly capable of making a simple meal. Besides, we are partners now, remember. That means sometimes I cook and sometimes you cook." Adelaide sat in one of the chairs by the fire and watched Dalton move around the cabin, preparing food with an easy competence. He made a simple stew with dried meat and vegetables, and it was the best thing Adelaide had tasted in months, probably because she was not the one who had to cook it. After they ate, Dalton said, "I should show you where things are for sleeping. I mean, the bed is up in the loft. I can sleep down here on the floor if you would prefer, until you feel more comfortable with the arrangement." Adelaide felt her face heat. She had been trying not to think about this part, the fact that she was married now and married people shared a bed. Dalton had been so respectful and patient that she had almost forgotten the physical side of marriage would be expected eventually. "What would you prefer?" she asked. "Honestly, I would like to sleep next to my wife, but only if she is comfortable with that. I am not going to force anything, Adelaide. We can take this as slow as you need to." Adelaide thought about it. She was nervous, certainly, but she trusted Dalton in a way she had not expected to trust anyone. And the thought of sleeping alone in that big bed seemed wrong somehow. They were married. They should be together. "I would like to sleep next to my husband," she said softly. Dalton's smile was warm and relieved. "Good. That makes me happy." As full dark fell, they prepared for bed. Adelaide changed into her new nightgown in the corner while Dalton politely turned away. When she climbed the ladder to the loft, she found him already under the covers, bare-chested, his long hair loose around his shoulders. Adelaide slipped into bed beside him, acutely aware of his presence, his warmth, his size. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, the mattress stuffed with something soft, the quilts and furs heavy and warm. "Adelaide," Dalton said into the darkness, "I meant what I said. We can take everything as slow as you need to. I am not going to pressure you. I know," she paused, "but we are married. You have rights." "Rights?" He rolled over to face her, his eyes catching the faint light from the fire below. "That is a terrible way to think about it. I do not want you to be with me because you think it is your duty. I want you to want me the same way I want you, and if that takes time, then it takes time." Adelaide felt something tight in her chest loosen a little more. "I do want you," she said quietly. "I am just scared. I do not know what to expect, and I do not want to disappoint you. You could never disappoint me." Dalton reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "How about this? Tonight we just sleep. We hold each other and we rest and we get used to being together. And then when you are ready, whenever that is, we will figure out the rest. Does that sound all right?" "Yes," Adelaide whispered. "That sounds perfect." Dalton pulled her close, and Adelaide rested her head on his broad chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. His arm came around her, holding her secure, and Adelaide felt safer than she had felt since her mother died. "Good night, Adelaide," Dalton murmured into her hair. "Good night, Dalton." Adelaide woke to the gray light of dawn filtering through the small window in the loft. For a moment she was disoriented, and then she remembered. She was married. She was in Dalton's cabin, high in the mountains, and she was free. Dalton was still asleep beside her, his face relaxed and younger looking in sleep. Adelaide studied him in the quiet morning light, this man who had changed her life so completely in such a short time. He really was handsome, she thought, in a rough, weathered way, strong and solid and real. As if sensing her gaze, Dalton's eyes opened. He smiled when he saw her watching him. "Morning, wife, morning, husband. How did you sleep? Better than I have in months, maybe years." "Good." He stretched, the muscles in his arms and chest flexing, and Adelaide felt a flutter of something in her stomach that was not nervousness. "Want to see something?" They dressed and went outside into the crisp morning air. The sun was just starting to paint the peaks of the distant mountains pink and gold. Dalton led Adelaide around to the east side of the cabin where the view was unobstructed, and they stood together watching the sun rise over the vast wilderness spread out before them. "I watch this every morning," Dalton said. "Never gets old. Every sunrise is different, every one beautiful in its own way." Adelaide leaned against him, and his arm came around her shoulders naturally. "I can see why you love it here. You think you will be happy here, really happy. It is pretty isolated. The winters are hard. We will not see another soul for weeks or months at a time." Adelaide thought about her life before, the constant demands and criticism, the endless work with no appreciation, the gray drudgery of every day. She thought about the attic room that was barely warmer than the outdoors and Mrs. Palmer's sharp eyes and sharper tongue. "I will be happy here," she said with certainty. "I would rather be isolated with you than surrounded by people who do not care if I live or die." "Good, because I am planning on keeping you for a very long time." True to his word from that first promise, Dalton brought Adelaide wildflowers every single morning. Sometimes he had to dig through snow to find them. Sometimes he brought evergreen branches or interesting pine cones instead, but he always brought something to brighten the cabin and make her smile. The first few weeks of their marriage passed in a sweet haze of discovery. Adelaide learned the rhythms of the cabin, how to manage the stove and fireplace, where everything was kept, how to make do with what they had. Dalton was a patient teacher, showing her how to prepare game, how to tan hides, how to make soap and candles, 100 small skills she needed for mountain life. And slowly, gradually, they learned each other. Adelaide discovered that Dalton liked his coffee strong and black, that he hummed while he worked, that he had a scar on his left shoulder from a run-in with a bear 3 years ago. Dalton learned that Adelaide was afraid of mice, but not of much else, that she had a quick mind and learned new skills rapidly, that when she laughed, it was a sound he wanted to hear over and over again. They grew comfortable with each other, with casual touches and easy affection. And then one night, 3 weeks after their wedding, as they lay together in the loft, Adelaide turned to Dalton and kissed him. It was different from the sweet kiss after their wedding. This was deeper, more urgent, full of want. Dalton responded immediately, his arms coming around her, pulling her close. "Adelaide," he said against her lips, "are you sure?" "I am sure. I want you. I want to really be your wife." What followed was awkward in moments, as first times often are, but also tender and sweet. Dalton was patient and careful, making sure she was all right, moving slowly. And Adelaide discovered that desire was not something to be feared, but something to be embraced, shared between two people who cared for each other. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilts, both breathing hard, and Adelaide felt complete in a way she had never experienced before. "Are you all right?" Dalton asked, his voice rough. "I am wonderful," Adelaide said honestly. "That was wonderful." Dalton's laugh was low and pleased. "It will get even better as we figure each other out." "I look forward to that," Adelaide said, and Dalton laughed again, pulling her close. Winter deepened, and the snow piled high around the cabin. Adelaide had been worried about cabin fever, about being trapped inside with nothing to do, but she found the opposite was true. There was always work: cooking, cleaning, mending clothes, tanning the hides from Dalton's trap lines, making soap and candles, preparing food for storage. And in the evenings, they talked or read aloud to each other from the few books Dalton owned, or simply sat by the fire together, comfortable in silence. Jake stopped by once during a break in the weather, bringing fresh venison and staying for dinner. He regaled them with stories about the old days, when he had first come to the mountains 40 years ago. Adelaide liked him immediately. He had a rough kindness about him, and a sense of humor that had Dalton laughing in a way Adelaide suspected he had not laughed in a long time. "You are good for him," Jake told Adelaide privately as he was preparing to leave. "He has been alone too long. Man needs someone to share his life with." "He is good for me too," Adelaide said. "He saved me in a way." "I think maybe you saved each other," Jake said wisely. Christmas came, and Adelaide made it special despite their limited resources. She baked bread and made a venison roast with vegetables from the root cellar. Dalton surprised her with a gift, a beautiful comb he had carved from bone, the handle decorated with an intricate pattern of leaves and flowers. "It is beautiful," Adelaide breathed, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "You made this. Been working on it at night while you were asleep. Thought you could use something better than that broken old comb of your mother's." Adelaide threw her arms around him, overcome. "Thank you. I love it. I will treasure it always." "I have something for you too," she said, suddenly shy. She pulled out a shirt she had been sewing from soft buckskin, working on it in secret whenever Dalton was out checking his traps. "I know it is not much." "Not much. Adelaide, this is incredible." Dalton held up the shirt, examining her neat stitches and the careful construction. "This must have taken you forever. I wanted to make you something. You have given me so much." Dalton pulled her into a kiss that turned into more, and they did not eat dinner until much later, reheating the food and eating it wrapped in quilts in front of the fire, laughing at themselves. Winter turned to spring, and the snow began to melt. The meadow where Dalton had first brought Adelaide began to bloom, exactly as he had promised, a riot of color that seemed impossible after the long white winter. "It is even more beautiful than I imagined," Adelaide said, walking through the flowers that came up to her knees. "I told you." Dalton was gathering a huge bouquet, picking the best blooms. "I wanted you to see it like this." They spread a blanket and had a picnic, surrounded by wildflowers and birdsong, and Adelaide thought about how different her life was now compared to a year ago. She was healthy now, no longer thin and exhausted. Her hands were still rough from work, but it was work she did for herself and Dalton, not for someone who did not appreciate her. She wore clothes that fit and kept her warm. She had a home that was hers, a husband who treated her with respect and affection, and she had wildflowers. Every single morning, just as Dalton had promised. "What are you thinking about?" Dalton asked, lying next to her in the flowers. "About how happy I am, about how different my life is now. Better, I hope. So much better. Sometimes I wake up and I cannot believe this is real, that I get to live like this." Dalton rolled over and propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her seriously. "Adelaide, I need to tell you something. I think I have been in love with you for a while now, but I wanted to make sure, wanted to be certain before I said it. I am certain now. I love you. I love your strength and your kindness and your laugh and the way you look at flowers and the way you look at me. I love the life we are building together. I love you." Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes, happy tears this time. "I love you too. I think I started falling in love with you the first time you brought me flowers. I definitely loved you by the time we got married." and I love you more every single day." Dalton kissed her then, deep and slow, and Adelaide kissed him back, surrounded by wildflowers and mountain air and the promise of a future full of beauty and love. Summer arrived, and they worked together to plant a garden in the cleared space Dalton had prepared. Adelaide had never gardened before, but Dalton was a patient teacher, showing her how to plant and water and weed. By midsummer, they had beans and squash and potatoes growing, the beginnings of a harvest that would help sustain them through the next winter. Jake visited more frequently in the warmer weather, sometimes staying for a few days, helping Dalton with big projects like fixing the roof of the barn or cutting wood for the winter. He treated Adelaide like a beloved daughter, teaching her mountain skills that even Dalton did not know, tricks learned from 40 years of living in the wilderness. One day in late July, Adelaide woke feeling strange. She was nauseous, and certain smells that had never bothered her before suddenly made her stomach turn. It took her a few days to realize what it might mean, and another week to be sure. She told Dalton one evening as they sat by the fire, "I think I might be pregnant." Dalton went very still, and then a huge smile spread across his face. "Really? Are you sure?" "Pretty sure. All the signs are there. I think the baby will come in late winter or early spring." Dalton pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "A baby. We are going to have a baby." He pulled back to look at her face. "How do you feel about it? Are you happy?" "I am happy, and scared. I do not know anything about babies or childbirth. We will figure it out together, and Jake will help. He has delivered a fair number of babies in his time. We will make sure you and the baby are well taken care of." True to his word, Dalton became even more protective and attentive. He took over the heavier chores, insisting Adelaide rest more. He consulted Jake, who gave them advice and promised to stay close when Adelaide's time came. The pregnancy was not easy. Adelaide had morning sickness for the first few months, and as she grew larger, everything became more difficult. But Dalton was there through all of it, patient and loving, rubbing her aching back and feet, bringing her tea and sympathy, never complaining about the extra work he took on. And every morning, without fail, he brought her wildflowers. Even when the snow came again and flowers were impossible to find, he brought pine boughs or interesting rocks or anything beautiful he could find, continuing the tradition that had started their story. Winter settled in again, Adelaide's second in the mountains. She was very pregnant now, moving slowly and carefully, uncomfortable most of the time. But she was not afraid. She had Dalton and Jake and a warm cabin and everything she needed. In late February, on a cold, clear night, Adelaide went into labor. Jake had been staying with them for the past week, waiting for this moment. He and Dalton helped Adelaide through the long hours of labor, Jake with his calm competence and Dalton with his steady presence and encouraging words. Just before dawn, as the sky was starting to lighten, Adelaide gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Jacob after their friend, and the old mountain man cried when they told him, not ashamed of his tears. "He is perfect," Dalton said, holding his son with careful reverence. "Adelaide, he is absolutely perfect." Adelaide, exhausted but happy, watched her husband hold their baby and felt her heart expand with love. This was her family. This was her life. A cabin in the mountains, a husband who loved her, a new baby, and wildflowers every morning. It was more than she had ever dreamed of having. The years passed, full and rich. Jacob grew into a sturdy, adventurous boy who loved the mountains as much as his father did. When he was 3, Adelaide gave birth to a daughter they named Lily, after Adelaide's mother. 2 years after that, another son, Daniel, joined the family. The cabin became full of noise and laughter and the chaos of children. Dalton expanded it, adding another room so the children would have their own space. The garden grew larger to feed their growing family. Adelaide learned to manage 3 young children and a household and helped Dalton with the endless work of mountain life. It was hard work, but it was good work. And every single morning, no matter how busy or chaotic life got, Dalton brought Adelaide wildflowers. In the summer, it was fresh blooms from the meadow. In winter, it was dried flowers he had pressed and saved, or small beautiful things he found in the woods. The children grew up knowing that their father brought their mother flowers every morning, that it was a sign of his love and commitment. Jacob, when he was about 8, asked his father why he did it. "Because your mother never owned anything pretty before I met her," Dalton said. "And I decided that needed to change. Plus, it makes her smile, and I like seeing her smile." "Will I bring flowers to my wife someday?" Jacob asked. "If you are smart, you will," Dalton said. "A woman deserves to know she is loved and appreciated. Flowers are an easy way to show that." Adelaide, listening from the doorway, felt her eyes fill with tears. Even after all these years, Dalton could still make her cry with his thoughtfulness and love. As the children grew older and more independent, Adelaide and Dalton found they had more time for each other again. They took walks together in the evenings, just the two of them, talking about everything and nothing. They still laughed together, still desired each other, still built their life together one day at a time. Jake grew older, moving a little slower each year, but he remained a constant presence in their lives, a beloved member of their family. The children called him Grandpa Jake, and he taught them everything he knew about surviving and thriving in the mountains. When Jacob was 15, Lily 12, and Daniel 10, Jake passed away peacefully in his sleep during a visit to their cabin. They buried him in the meadow full of wildflowers, marking his grave with a carved wooden cross. Dalton and Adelaide both cried, mourning the loss of their friend. But life continued as it does. The children grew into capable young adults. Jacob fell in love with a girl from one of the neighboring ranches and got married, building his own cabin on land Dalton helped him claim. Lily grew into a beautiful young woman who was as tough and capable as her mother. Daniel developed his father's talent for trapping and trading. And through it all, through every joy and sorrow, every triumph and difficulty, Dalton brought Adelaide wildflowers every single morning. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Adelaide woke to find Dalton already up, sitting on the edge of the bed with a bouquet of flowers in his hands. But these were different from his usual offerings. These were every type of wildflower that grew in their meadow, arranged into a huge, spectacular bouquet. "Happy anniversary," he said, handing them to her. "Dalton, these are incredible. You must have been up for hours gathering all these. I wanted today to be special. 20 years, Adelaide. 20 years since you took a chance on a rough mountain man who had nothing to offer but hard work and wildflowers. You offered me so much more than that," Adelaide said, setting the flowers aside and pulling him close. "You offered me freedom and respect and love. You offered me a life worth living. You gave me everything that matters." "I think we gave each other everything that matters," Dalton said, kissing her softly. They spent the day together, just the two of them, walking to all their favorite places. The meadow where he had first brought her, now so full of memories. The spot where they had told each other they loved each other. The ridge where they had stood together countless times, watching the sun rise over the mountains. That evening, as they sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset, Adelaide thought about the girl she had been 20 years ago. Tired and thin and desperate, owning nothing but 3 ragged possessions and a mountain of grief. That girl could never have imagined this life, this family, this happiness. "What are you thinking about?" Dalton asked, taking her hand. "About that first morning you left me flowers. How much it meant to me, having someone care enough to bring me something beautiful just because. I had never had that before. You deserved it. You deserved everything good." "I know that now," Adelaide said, "but I did not know it then. You taught me that I was worthy of love and kindness. You taught me that life could be beautiful, not just about survival." "You taught me some things too," Dalton said. "You taught me that living alone in the mountains might have been enough, but living with someone you love is so much better. You taught me that sharing life with a partner makes everything richer and more meaningful. You taught me what real love looks like." Adelaide leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to pink to purple. The mountains stood eternal around them, and Adelaide thought that this place that had seemed so remote and intimidating at first had become her true home. The years continued to pass. They became grandparents when Jacob and his wife had children. Lily eventually married a rancher's son and settled on land not too far away. Daniel remained closer to home, building his own cabin just a mile down the mountain, close enough to help his aging parents but far enough to have his own life. As Adelaide and Dalton grew older, their children worried about them living alone so far from town. But neither Adelaide nor Dalton had any interest in leaving their mountain. This was their home, the place where they had built their life together. "Besides," Adelaide told her worried children, "your father still brings me wildflowers every single morning. Why would I want to leave that?" Even as they grew old together, Dalton never stopped his morning ritual. His hair turned gray, then white, and he moved a little slower, but every morning he went out and found something beautiful to bring his wife. On a morning in late spring, when Adelaide was 71 and Dalton was 77, Adelaide woke to find him sitting on the edge of the bed, just as he had done thousands of times before. He had a small bouquet of early asters in his hand, purple and white, just like the first wildflowers he had ever given her 51 years ago. "Good morning, love," he said, handing her the flowers. "Good morning," Adelaide said, taking them with a smile that was as bright as it had been when she was 20. "They are beautiful. Not as beautiful as you." Adelaide laughed. "I am an old woman, Dalton. Gray hair, wrinkles everywhere, hands twisted with arthritis." "You are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen," Dalton said firmly. "And I will think so until the day I die." He leaned in to kiss her, and Adelaide kissed him back, thinking that this moment, this simple morning ritual that had sustained them through 51 years of marriage, was the greatest gift anyone had ever given her. They lived several more good years together, surrounded by children and grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. And every single morning, Dalton brought Adelaide wildflowers or something beautiful from the mountains they both loved. When Dalton finally passed away at the age of 82, peacefully in his sleep in the bed they had shared for so many years, Adelaide mourned him deeply. But she did not regret a single day of their life together. He had given her everything she never knew she needed: love, respect, partnership, beauty, and a life full of meaning. At his funeral, their children told stories about their father. But it was Adelaide who had the last word. "Your father was the best man I ever knew," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "He took a chance on a girl who had nothing and treated her like she was worth everything. He worked hard, loved deeply, and never forgot what was important. And every single morning of our marriage, he brought me wildflowers because he wanted to make sure I had beauty in my life. That is who he was. That is how he will always be remembered." Adelaide lived for 3 more years, staying in the cabin with Daniel nearby to help her. She missed Dalton terribly, but she found comfort in her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and in the knowledge that she had lived a full and beautiful life. Every morning, she woke to find fresh wildflowers by her bed. Daniel had taken over his father's tradition, making sure his mother still had flowers every day. It made Adelaide smile even through her grief, knowing that Dalton's legacy of love and thoughtfulness lived on. On a bright spring morning, when the meadow was full of wildflowers and the mountains were green with new growth, Adelaide passed away peacefully in the cabin she and Dalton had shared for over half a century. She was buried next to Dalton in the meadow, under a sky so blue it hurt to look at, surrounded by wildflowers. Their children placed fresh flowers on both graves, a tradition that would continue as long as their family remained in these mountains. And the story of the mountain man who brought his wife wildflowers every single morning became a family legend, passed down through generations. Because Adelaide had never owned anything pretty in her life until Dalton gave her wildflowers. And in doing so, he had given her everything that mattered: love, respect, beauty, and a life well lived. Their love story became the foundation of their family's values, teaching each generation that true love is found in daily acts of kindness and thoughtfulness, in seeing someone's worth when others do not, and in making sure the person you love knows they are cherished. The cabin still stands in the mountains outside Santa Fe, preserved by the family as a reminder of where it all began. And in the meadow where Dalton first brought Adelaide to see the wildflowers, their descendants still gather on special occasions, telling stories about the mountain man and the woman who had nothing until he gave her everything that mattered.